Bonani, Dumelang, re go qala session ya kajeno. I hope you all enjoyed the session with Lucy and that you are feeling calm, zen, and that you are ready for self-compassion and to run Ubuntu-centered institutions. On the subject of institutions, today's plenary will be looking at the issue of threatened and collapsing institutions. We've got four fantastic speakers, presenters. First up, we have Dr. Mbogeseni Buthelezi from PARI. Secondly, we have Ziyanda Striman from the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab. Thirdly, we've got Mbegeseli Benjamin from Judges Matter. And then last but not least, we've got Zikwisa Kota from the Public Service Accountability Monitor. So we will allow them to present for a few minutes and then we'll take questions. Each of them will be addressing specific aspects of the state. So we look forward to hearing from them. I will let all four of them present and then we will take questions afterwards. Dr. Buthelezi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Madlingozi, and good morning, colleagues. It's nice to be with you this morning. I'm going to jump off. Let me start by saying I'm going to jump off from what Stembile Mbete in her address yesterday touched on, which is looking back at why have we got to where we are in terms of the collapse of the state. I mean, the pockets of the state that are collapsing, and there are some that have pretty much all but collapsed. How have we got here, very briefly, and what can we do about it as civil society organizations, as residents in the country? Let me start by saying, I think many of us will agree that a well-functioning state is essential for social justice. Why is that the case? I think, I mean, in our context in South Africa, in looking back, we've had nearly 400 years of various colonial intrusions, imperialism, of apartheid, and we need redistribution. I mean, I think that is one of the crucial things that I agreed on, actually, in the transition to democracy. Redistribution is crucial. Redistribution in the form of, among other things, the redistribution of land, for instance. We continue to have a skewed, very, very skewed land ownership, land holding in the country. And we've had processes to try and redistribute that have largely failed. I mean, successes have been few and far between. And as the critiques have been advanced, we know now that part of the reason why that process has failed is that the capabilities of the state to drive that project have been pretty weak. In fact, we're currently doing a project that's looking at the evolution of the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, or it's called something else now, over a 20-year period. And the department has never really been built to be able to carry out its mandate. It's the case with many other parts of the state. And we heard yesterday a second element where the state has not had the capabilities it requires when it comes to income support as one element of redistribution that is absolutely crucial, given where our economy is in the country, given the state of poverty and inequality that we're currently facing. And things, of course, have been going from bad to worse, particularly in the period of the pandemic. And I also want to touch briefly on the July unrest and how it's compounded some of these problems. Another critical area, of course, when we're thinking about redistribution is job creation in this country, where we have an economy that was set up and continues to operate in very extractive ways, with very few people, particularly people who are politically connected, who've been able to move themselves into positions where they can accumulate very quickly. Redistribution is absolutely essential when it comes to the way in which our economy operates. A new economy essentially needs to be built. And we've heard a lot of talk about that, very little in terms of concrete plans, very little in terms of persuasive plans for how this is going to be achieved. And for all of this to be achieved, a well-functioning state, a well-constructed state, I should also say, is one of the essential elements that we need. And a last element, when it comes to social justice, that we also need to bear in mind is that one of the things we need, and when we're talking about social justice, is that we need a more equitable enjoyment of rights, but also crucially, a more equitable shouldering of the burdens that this society faces. And one of the things that we've seen a great deal of in this country in the last 27 odd years is that people, certainly marginalized people, deliberately marginalized in many cases, are people who shoulder most of the burdens, who live in conditions that are simply intolerable, who live in places that are uninhabitable. And those who are wealthier live lives much more comfortable. That's one of the things that need to be corrected and need the state to play a central role in correcting, in how the burdens of our society are carried, are shouldered. Now, having laid that foundation for why we need the state, and we need the state to operate optimally, to be designed also to operate optimally, I want to move on to saying much has been achieved. And in its election season, we hear a lot of emphasis on what has been achieved. But there's a lot. I'm not going to dwell on what has been achieved. What we hear is what has been achieved in terms of, say, rural electrification of places that previously had no electricity, the provision of water and basic sanitation to a lot of places that were marginalized, ignored, under apartheid and under prior systems of oppression. Of course, a lot of this has been done, but as we argue in some of our more recent work at the Public Affairs Research Institute, a lot of this is simply insufficient, as many of us know, because simply giving somebody an electricity point where they can connect to the grid without that electricity being affordable, without the person having the means to actually buy that electricity, is simply not good enough. It's not giving somebody access to electricity. It's not giving somebody the kind of access that they need to create a livelihood for themselves. And that's one of the problems, that the state does things in half measures. It takes us part way to achieving the goals that were set out in the transition, but actually it stops at that point without actually going all the way. And then the political parties want us to celebrate that they've achieved things that only have been half achieved. And that is where we need to do a lot of work, actually point these things out and to push for them to be seen through to completion. So, for example, when it comes to the electricity, as I've flagged, one of the questions some of my colleagues are asking is, what does the equitable distribution of electricity look like? What does affordable energy look like in the country? At the moment, so far we've not had that conversation, and we need to have it to be able to push the state to get us to where it is promised to get us. So there have been some achievements, they've been insufficient, and much more could have been achieved. Much more could also have been achieved if corruption had not taken root, and so much money that could be going towards providing a better life for residents in the country is not being siphoned off into the private pockets of some individuals, of some politicians, of some people in the state, in fact, who work in these networks of business people, of politicians, and of state actors, of public servants that have been forming all these networks that coordinate around the rules. So how do we? I mean, that's the second thing, that much more could have been achieved. Let me then move on to the third thing that I want to just point to. COVID-19, as the framing of this panel points out, has shown up some of the major shortcomings in the state, some of the major shortcomings in the society. So what these include, of course, the massive poverty and the inequality gap that is growing in this country. It has also shown up that state responses to the suffering of people that was compounded. I mean, already had been happening on a massive scale prior to COVID-19, but was compounded by COVID-19. State responses have been inadequate. We heard yesterday, for example, food distribution was insufficient. In some cases, food distribution, the provision of those very paltry food parcels was captured by certain political interests. We saw cases being publicized, covered in the media, where we had certain councillors distributing food parcels as part of their patronage machines to people who support them, to people who are part of their political networks, part of their political organizations.
Can I just make an announcement quickly, please? Colleagues, comrades, please, let's mute ourselves when you are not speaking. Please mute yourself. Thank you. You can continue, Doc.
Thank you. We've heard also yesterday in that income distribution, the social relief of distress grants, for example, have been distributed in such an uneven way. And in many cases, I mean, we heard the story yesterday of how badly people have been treated by state officials, in some cases just because they are refugees or asylum seekers, migrants. They've been told that they do not qualify, should not be given, but they'll be given grudgingly these grants to which they are entitled. And what we've seen, of course, in all of this is the stepping up in a major way of regular people, residents feeding neighbors who are in distress, of social justice organizations, civil society organizations, stepping up, getting involved in food distribution, in helping to ameliorate the problem. State incapacity is the fourth thing I want to touch on. And how did we get here? How do we have a state that is unable to respond adequately to the need that is very publicly visible and has been compounded and made more visible by COVID-19 and by the unrest in July this year? There are several factors that have been contributed to this. 2 minutes, okay. Those factors include that we inherited a broken state. We keep talking about returning to something that we seem to have had before, but we've actually never had a state that works for some people. There are pockets of excellence meant to serve a minority in the country. The majority face dysfunctional states in the Bantustans, for example, in places like where I grew up in KwaZulu, where civil servants could treat you however they wanted. And there have been continuities in the present with some of those cultures of public service. There's been little investment, as Tembile Mbete pointed to yesterday, in state building in the country. We made very assumptions that we had done the work in the first 3-5 years of building the state we wanted to see. And in fact, we hadn't. It was meant to be, it should be continuous work of state building that has been neglected. There were also some fundamental errors, I think is the third point, made in the 1990s in policy design, in the design of institutions that have come back to haunt us today, which we can talk about in discussion. There have been some pockets of excellence. SARS has been pointed out as one of those institutions, but the good work done in some of those institutions, in the NPA, in building the Scorpions, for example, was undone partly by some decisions taken in the ANC, partly by this phenomenon, of course, that we've been hearing about at the Zondo Commission called state capture. So where do we go from here to end off? One of the things that need to happen, of course, is investment in state building. some of the work that we've been doing, some of the arguments we've been making, is focus on some key areas, such as reforming recruitment practices, so that who you bring into jobs in the state are people who are qualified, who have the right attitude, orientation that can be brought in to working for the state. Reform procurement practices to close the gap for the kind of looting that we've seen in PPE procurement, for example, in the last 18 months. We need civil society campaigns that focus on building state institutions. Not enough has been done by us in civil society. There's been some work, but it needs to go further. Some of the current initiatives, just to end off, include the Civil Society Working Group on State Capture that has been focusing on the Zondo Commission, and that needs to take its work forward into thinking about where are the areas of reform that can be game changers for the future. There's some work being done on the National Anti-Corruption Strategy since 2016 that we've had some involvement in, but that work needs to be brought to conclusion and a national strategy implemented. There's a public procurement working group, and there's some government efforts as well, such as something called the Public Sector Optimization Project that's being done by the Department of Public Service and Administration, including as one of its pillars a ministerial task team that's developing the document that Stembile referred to yesterday into more concrete proposals for how we can, in the short, medium, and long term, actually run programs to professionalize the public service. I currently serve as the only civil society representative on that task team. I think what we need to do is demand transparency in these processes that are currently being run inside government, and in the involvement of civil society in those processes. It's not enough that I'm the only representative of civil society on a ministerial task team that's tasked with professionalizing the public service. And finally, I think we need to monitor and much more closely than we have done. Public service reform is not a sexy thing, and a lot of us think it's enough to demand that policy be implemented, as Thembile said yesterday, but we need to be much more closely involved in things such as there's a process to amend the Public Service Act, to amend the Public Administration Management Act that are ongoing, and we need to be monitoring those and giving our inputs into those processes and demanding that civil society be included in those processes. I'll stop there for now. Thank you, Prof.
Excellent. Thank you so much for kicking us off and for that broad overview. A lot to think about and a lot to debate too. So next up, we have Zianda, who I think will be focusing on the SAPS. Zianda, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Prof. Madlingozi, and thank you to Dr. Buthelezi for kicking us off today. So I'm going to go ahead and start my contribution to today's discussion and conversation with a very necessary disclaimer, and that is that I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you in the next 10 minutes. You may want to jot down some of these numbers or focus on just a few, but I have often found in conversations with people and in the process of writing my book, Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa, and in many other panel discussions that I've been part of, that people who don't research the police and who don't research the practice of policing and the ways in which the police shape our society, and importantly, the ways in which we shape the police as well, can't sometimes grasp just how spectacular the problems are within the institution and just how urgent the crisis of policing has become. So let's do that today with a particular look at the threats facing the police, both those that are self-made and those that are external, and also the various levels of collapse that we face within the institution. So let's talk about the SAPS and some basic numbers that help us understand its size and its mandate. As of November 2020, the SAPS employed 187,358 people. So roughly 160 of those people are police officers. According to the medium-term budget that was tabled in Parliament by Police Minister Bheki Cele in May 2021, the SAP's budget expenditure in 2020 and 2021 was 99.6 billion rand, and the institution's budget would be an estimated 97.1 billion rand in 2021-2022. It is important here to note that a decade ago, the SAP's budget stood at 55.6 billion rand in 2012, and therefore the current SAP's budget represents a 65.6% increase from 2012. This is one of very few state institutions that have seen such a large budget increase over the past decade. When tabling the budget in Parliament earlier this year, the police minister said that the compensation of employees accounted for about 78% of the budget over the preceding 3-year period. With this large increase in fiscal investment in policing over the past decade, we should see a positive relationship between crime rates, right? So in other words, because we've spent so much money on policing and the police budget, the majority of which goes to police personnel salaries, we should also see a similar decrease in crime levels. Unfortunately, that's not the case. According to research and analysis by Lizette Lancaster and the Institute for Security Studies, the police's ability to solve murders has declined by 38% since 2011-2012, with the result that between 2019 and 2020, detectives within the SAPS were only able to solve 19 out of every 100 murders reported to them. Again, that's an ability to solve just 19% of all murders. In the same year that police were only able to solve 1/5 of the murders reported to them, there were 21,325 murders recorded. South Africa consistently records about 20,000 murders a year, and it is really terrifying to think that only 1/5 of them can be solved in any given year. Murder rates are an important indicator of crime levels across the board, as policing and safety experts strongly agree that murder is the most reliable measure of crime rates, given that murders are often, if not always, reported to the police. This is not always the case or true for a variety of other crimes, particularly cases involving gender-based violence. For perspective and context, in the case of aggravated robbery, also in 2019-2020, only 17% of those reported cases were solved. Another factor to put this into context, and other categories of violent crime have also increased in the decade between 2010 and 2020. So for example, armed robberies have increased by 43% in the same time period. I could continue with similar comparisons of other categories of crime, but I think the point is quite clearly made that there is no discernible relationship, never mind a positive relationship, between how much we invest and pour into the police budget every year and lower rates of crime in the country. Worse so, there's almost no relationship between the annual police budget and the police service's ability to solve crimes. With this perspective on the overall funding and function of the police, I also think it's important to spend some time thinking about the inner workings of the police too. So let's start this by looking at the SAPS's ability to investigate cases of unlawful conduct, violence, brutality, and other instances of ill discipline within its ranks. So according to Gareth Newham's research, again at the Institute for Security Studies, the Police Accountability Watchdog, known as the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, or IPID, had only referred 16% of the 47,984 cases that were opened against police officers between 2012 and 2020 for disciplinary action. Of that small fraction of cases that were referred for disciplinary action, only 3.2 ended up in disciplinary conviction, and only 0.4%, or 194 actual police officers, were dismissed as a result. So think about that again in real numbers. In the 8 years between 2012 and 2020, and of the 47,984 complaints laid against the police that run the gamut from unlawful arrests, complaints of sexual abuse, sexual harassment and sexual violence, cases of torture, coerced testimonies, corruption, and other categories, only 194 police officers were found guilty of the complaints laid against them and dismissed as a result. If you follow the investigative reporting work of Danielle Knutzer and an organization called Viewfinder Journalism, you'll find a mountain of investigations into the ways in which IPID has been systematically, underfunded, under-resourced, and undermined in their mandated work of holding police officers to account for their unlawful conduct. In a very short summary of that investigative work, Viewfinder have found that senior police officers routinely exploit legal and regulatory loopholes to protect their colleagues implicated in violent crimes, which include assault, torture, shootings, rape, and unlawful killings. All of the testimony that has come out of the trial of the 3 police officers accused of killing Nathaniel Julies, a 16-year-old boy in El Dorado Park in August last year, really put into perspective just how often the police lie about their violence and brutality, and how often senior police officials and even politicians are willing to help them. I really cannot recommend enough engaging with Viewfinder's work, because as a society, we cannot and should not underestimate just how much impunity the police believe that they can act with. Now, in perhaps the most searing indictment of the police's seeming inability to do very much to facilitate community safety, I think it's worth illustrating just how badly crime intelligence failed in the face of the July unrest that absolutely roiled KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. The Criminal Intelligence Division within the SAPS has 8,000 personnel members and a budget of 4 billion rand annually. But in a Daily Maverick article written by journalist Marianne Tam in late July this year, the current head of the division, Lieutenant General Yolisa Magabudi, described the division as being penniless, and she accused Minister Bheki Cele of refusing to sign off on a 500 million rand budget increase into the division, which has been and was unable to provide accurate and timely intelligence ahead of the unrest. She said that this was because of years of looting and mismanagement, and which made it impossible for the division to serve its function in preventing major threats, which was similar to those that we saw manifest in July. And if I haven't infuriated you enough with all of this talk about the Criminal Intelligence Division, then the fact that their budget increased by 113% between 2011 and 2020 should do the trick. So that's 113% increase to an annual budget of 4 billion rand and 8,000 staff in the Criminal Intelligence Division. I really could go on until the end of this entire gathering tonight at 6 p.m. and I could go into detail on how a backlog of nearly 200,000 DNA samples has been allowed to gather at the SAPS's Forensic Laboratory Service. And I could also tell you about how that crisis was worsened by the fact that up until June this year, there were 150 vacant posts within the laboratory service, and that in fact, both the Department of Health and the police were warned about these backlogs in the service all the way back in 2011 through a Public Service Commission report, and also a report to the Parliamentary Police Portfolio Committee. But honestly, at this point, I think we all understand how dire the multiple and compounding crises in the police service are. And of course, as with literally everything in our society, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the threats facing the police and the collapse of the institution in key places even worse. Crime rates absolutely plummeted during the various lockdown levels we've seen in the country over the past 18 months, particularly between April and August last year. But those dramatic decreases were then followed by very high increases in crime rates since the end of last year. Essentially, this means that the very harsh restrictions on movement and economic activities during lockdowns level 5 and 4 had significant impact on crime patterns and the activities and routines of organized crime networks, as well as the incidence of specific crimes such as cash in transit heists, hijacking, and others. In many ways, the pandemic has also made other types of crime worse. There is now a significant reported increase in the work of extortion rings operating in several cities and townships as organized criminals turn their attention to local businesses to extort for protection fees instead of their usual targets, which included nightclubs or drug trafficking circles or gun running rings. If you haven't heard of the Boko Haram gang operating in parts of Cape Town and Swane, you should consider yourself lucky. This is again a case where one particular type of crime has been replaced by a large increase in another type of crime. So to conclude this contribution, I could try and find some good news amongst the deluge of bad news that I've just presented. But in all honesty, there just isn't enough about the practice of policing that is going well right now. and there's certainly not enough within or around the country's national police institution. The only real upside right now is that there are good police officers who are trying to do good work. They are being failed by the institution just as badly as we are as citizens. And if we're going to work to fix the institution for any other reason, then we need to ensure real safety for the communities who need it most. Then we should work to reverse the rot, to stop the collapse, and to eradicate the threats for those police officers and the fact that they wake up every day to try and do a bit of good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zianda. A bearer of bad news, but we appreciate the frank discussion. Okay, next up we go from the police to the judiciary with Bex. Take the floor, please.
Thanks, Prof. Links, and thank you to the two presenters before me. Zianda gave a very sobering presentation on the state of the police, and there's a lot of bad news in it. And I've seen some of the reports from Viewfinder, and it's quite troubling. I'd like to speak about the judiciary and the role of the judiciary and the state of that institution in our society. Dr. Mbete yesterday spoke about that we need to move away from, as civil society organizations, we need to move away from litigation as our primary tool to using other forms of law. And I agree with that view. I think we need to be more creative in the strategies and the tools that we use. But I think taking matters to court and litigating is still an indispensable tool towards achieving social justice. And to whom do we take those claims to? And we take them to the judiciary. Now, the judiciary in South Africa overall, I think, is something that we should all be proud in terms of the independence that judges have shown and the strength of that institution and its resilience in the face of very challenging times, especially in the last few years. But there is some pause or reason for us to be concerned. There are signs that we are seeing where there's beginning to be rot within the institution of the judiciary, and it should really concern us. Now, I'm going to look at the performance of the judiciary using a bunch of indicators that the United Nations uses for assessing the rule of law, the quality of the rule of law in any particular society. Now, this the rule of law from this United Nations study, it looks at the police, the prosecutions, and the judiciary. I'm only going to be focusing on the judiciary. And there are four indicators that they've put forward, and I'm going to use those indicators as a framework to try and understand how the judiciary in South Africa is operating. And many of the things that I will identify are things that have been in existence pre-COVID, and COVID has simply made some of them a lot worse than they were before. So the four indicators are capacity, so institutional capacity in terms of money and people, performance of the institution, performance of the judiciary, integrity, transparency, and accountability. And then the fourth one is the treatment of vulnerable groups. So the first one is capacity. So the judiciary it's actually quite contentious what you define as the judiciary in South Africa, because we've had the system of the higher courts judiciary, which is anything above the high court all the way to the constitutional court, and what is now called the lower court judiciary, which is the magistrates court. For most South Africans, they will only ever step into a magistrates court. They'll never set foot in a high court, probably because of the barriers towards accessing the high courts. But when we think about the judiciary, our biggest focus has been on the higher courts judiciary, which some have criticized. Now, this has also translated into how this institution is built. So the higher courts judiciary, or the judiciary as a whole, is probably the only institution within government that is run by two separate departments. So you have the higher courts judiciary, which is run by a national government department called the Office of the Chief Justice, and then the lower courts judiciary, which is run by the Department of Justice. So the magistrates' courts are still run by the Department of Justice. And that is also another problem of state building that Dr. Buthelezi spoke about, is that there was supposed to be a move towards a single judiciary where the magistrates' courts will also be governed by one government department, similar to how the higher courts are run. But that has been a sort of a stillborn project, and that has caused problems even within that operation of that institution. And then there's the question of the money. So the Office of the Chief Justice, which is this new national government department that started in 2010, but really took off in 2014, is the only government department that has had a gradual cut to its budget since inception. So since 2014, its budget was around was a bit closer to 2 billion than 2 billion. And 2020-2021, it's about 2.3 billion versus 2.4 billion in the previous year. So there are money issues involved, and this also relates to this austerity program that government has gone into, and which people like the Institute for Economic Justice has been quite vocal on, that government austerity is causing real problems for the institutions in the state to properly discharge their functions. So there's a money problem involved, and then there's also a people problem in the judiciary where we don't have enough judges. If, for example, the Gauteng High Court did not have acting judges, did not appoint them on a regular basis, that court will collapse. And so what should properly happen is that there should be a larger complement of judges in that court. But for many years, those posts have not been expanded or filled precisely because of this austerity program. So, and this has an impact really on the access to justice in that court, because, for example, if you want a trial date in that court, a civil trial date, you're unlikely to get it anytime before 2023. So that also speaks to the quality of justice that you'll receive, because if there are only acting judges, the institutional safeguards that are there to protect the independence of the judiciary are not really that strong, because an acting judge is appointed for a short period of time, and they move around quite frequently, as opposed to permanent judges who have a security of tenure. And then moving on to the second indicator, which is performance. So court performance has been another point of debate, because the question is, what do you measure? Do you measure only the cases that have been finalized within a particular year, or do you measure cases going from inception until the end? Now there's this new norms and standards which says that a criminal case should run from within 9 months. So from start to finish, it must be 9 months. But we know that many cases take far longer to complete. And so there's a debate about the court performance when it comes to the number of cases that are finalized. But what we do know is that the onset of the pandemic has hugely increased the backlog of cases in the courts. There were parts of the lockdown where there were no cases that were being done at all, and only a few prioritized cases were being done. And I mentioned Gauteng. Gauteng operates using an online system called Case Lines for civil cases, not for criminal cases. And that system was supposed to be rolled out throughout the country, but again, because of the financial issues, it hasn't been. So even when the lockdown was gradually reduced, there were lots of cases that simply could not be done. There were some civil cases that could be finalized, but the vast majority could not be finalized. And so we sit with a high number of backlogs in many of our courts, especially in criminal cases. And then on the court performance, the UN indicators say that access to justice is a subset of court performance. So people's ability to access the courts is a factor. And we know pre-COVID, the cost of taking your case to court was extremely prohibitive, even for middle-class people. And with the few organizations in this sector doing valiant work, there have been able to take some of those cases to court, but overall the picture has been gloomy and it hasn't been good. COVID-19 has exacerbated those inequalities. Less and less people are actually able to afford taking their cases to court. And we know that even in our sector, there have been resource constraints such that even litigating is no longer as possible as it once was. So those are also challenges within the judiciary, but they affect a broader society. And then quickly moving on to issues of integrity, transparency, and accountability. Overall, our courts are transparent. You can walk into any courtroom and observe the proceedings, but of course, that's not a consistent picture throughout the country. There are some places where it's quite difficult to access the courts in terms of just going in to observe the proceedings, but particularly now during COVID-19 and the health regulations that have been put in place, you can't simply walk into a court. That has an impact on transparency of the court proceedings and people's ability to observe them. And then issues of integrity and independence are something that I would like to place some emphasis on, because they relate to how judges are appointed and how judges are held accountable for misconduct. And overall, the picture is not looking good. We are seeing, well, we are fortunate that good people are still being appointed as judges, but we are still seeing that the institution to appoint judges, the Judicial Service Commission, is sometimes not performing as it should. It is not doing the primary job of looking for good lawyers to become good judges. And that has an impact on the quality of justice that we receive. And it's actually an institutional threat to the judiciary. And then issues of accountability for misconduct, again, is another problem that we need to be zooming in on as civil society, where we see that complaints against judges are filed, but it takes a very long time for them to be dealt with, to the point where, in fact, we're now engaging with the impeachment process of Judge Hlophe, which has taken all of 13 years to finalize. Now, that does not bode well for the confidence that we should have in the judiciary, and it particularly it erodes the system of accountability in the judiciary. And then finally, on the treatment of vulnerable groups, which is another indicator that the United Nations put forward for the quality of the rule of law. Overall, we are fortunate in our country to have a Bill of Rights which protects a number of vulnerable groups, including children, women, sexual minorities. So that's something that we should be proud. And the courts have sometimes been at the forefront of pushing the boundaries of equality and ensuring the protection of vulnerable groups. But that is not enough. And particularly during COVID, where we've seen a huge spike in domestic violence cases, but the courts simply could not deliver the service of issuing interim protection orders or finalizing protection orders, because often you'd find someone, a complainant of domestic violence, will take their last money and travel to court, and you'll find that the court is not closed because the number of people that are allowed in. And that is a concern in terms of the protection of vulnerable groups in society. I must also add here that even during the hard lockdown, domestic violence cases were prioritized. So there were some services that were, and particularly as you go throughout the lower court system, which is the magistrates court, there was an inconsistent service that was provided, which leaves vulnerable people in danger. And then just to close, there are some also external, I've mainly spoken about internal threats to the judiciary, including people, money, resources, and the functionality of the courts. But there are also external threats to the judiciary. There's this talk of the politicization of the judiciary and the use of lawfare. Now, if you come from a political tradition that sees courts as a site of struggle, then politicization of the judiciary is a necessary means towards that end. But what we see now is that a failure in the other part of the state or in the politics of the country to resolve disputes means that they spill over into the courts, and the courts are dragged into political disputes that they would rather not be involved in. So last night we heard that the Premier of the Eastern Cape is taking the Hawks to court to stop an investigation into corrupt power. And I read the court papers of the Premier, and there's very little law in it. There's a lot of politics though. And it seems as if he's taking his political battles to court as some sort of, and the court is being forced to play some sort of arbiter in that. That is a threat to the judiciary, because what you'll often find is that in these highly politicized cases, judges or the judiciary is attacked in a way that undermines the confidence of the judiciary and the public perception of the judiciary. And over the last few months, we've heard from Afrobarometer saying that for the first time in as long as they've run the public perception survey, people's trust in the court has declined to about 43%, which means more people have less confidence in the courts than they have in the past. That should also alarm all of us, and we should be taking these external threats to the courts seriously. Now, what should the role of civil society be in addressing some of these problems I've identified? Number one, we should be speaking very strongly against the austerity program by government. It is hollowing out the courts. It is threatening the judiciary, because if judges have to do more work with less money, then the quality of justice in the end will be sort of negatively affected. And then secondly, we should be more active in monitoring and being vigilant on who gets appointed to be a judge, and holding the Judicial Service Commission accountable for firstly getting only the right people in, and making sure that people or judges who find themselves involved in misconduct are quickly removed from the system. So one of the things that I've been sad to see is the number of people who, civil society organizations that submit nominations for candidates to be judges. It's something that used to happen quite a lot in the past, and I'm sad to see the decline. As Judges Matter, we try to encourage people to nominate, but of course, it largely relies on people to take that challenge forward. Right now, with the appointment of the Chief Justice, objections are closing on Friday. So I'm hoping that people will put forward objections to some of the candidates or letters of support for others that they believe are the right people to be Chief Justice. And then on the question of, so I've spoken about the money, and I've spoken about the people that we need as judges and those that we don't need. I think
Bex, you've got 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, I'll take less than 2 minutes. The last point that I want to emphasize on is that there are reforms that are currently happening in the judiciary, and they, like I said, were stillborn. This move towards a single judiciary is something that was proposed but wasn't carried through. Civil society has the capacity sometimes to push forward some of these. We want people to tease. So how do we do that? Taking it up and forcing the Ministry of Justice, including the Office of the Chief Justice, in making sure that these reforms are seen all the way through. I unfortunately haven't been able to speak about traditional courts, which is another topic on its own, but that is also something as civil society. And with that, thank you.
Excellent, thank you for that call to action, Bex. Finally, we have Zugiswa. Zugiswa, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Prof. I'll start my timer as well and share my screen. And I hope I'm sharing the correct screen. Thank you so much to everyone. And I'm noting that my internet connection is unstable. So Prof. Madlingozi, if I break up, I'll just listen out for your voice because I can't see the chat.
Okay, we'll do so.
Thank you. I'll get right into it. What to me has been a really fascinating preceding inputs from my co-panelists. And I'll be talking about budget decisions, in the context of state institutions, public institutions. Of the four things I'd like to touch on, the SOE context, the NPA and its resourcing, the SIU and its resourcing. Hopefully, if I do have time, I'd like to also speak about public participation in fiscal and policy and budget processes. The one, Zianda made a disclaimer upfront in her presentation, and mine is that this isn't, an interrogation of the fiscal framework at all, and also isn't necessarily a discussion of the minutiae of budgets and resourcing, but is more about the context of decision making and possible implications within the resourcing context. We've, I think, quite extensively spoken about what COVID-19 has done and what it's exacerbated. And certainly the context of public financial management systems, that's been fundamental across the world, across the continent, and not least of all in South Africa. It's also curtailed our abilities to exert accountability and oversight in many ways, in many small ways and in many quite big ways. And I think the one area that is worth emphasizing in the context of this discussion is that COVID-19 also presented a lot of opportunities for just rampant corruption, and maybe less visibly the closing of civic space, which I see in the chat is coming up a bit. So I'd like to talk about later, if we get the chance, what interventions and what civil society's role in that space is. The other aspect is the context of opaque decision making, and this, of course, precedes the COVID-19 context. It has been a factor over several years in relation to public resources and how this has enabled the misuse or wastage of limited funds. We've seen recently what this has meant in the context of the state capture, exposés. Dismal oversight is also another area that plagues, institutions at all levels of government. Most recently, I think, what's now the infamous Komani stadium or not stadium at the local government level has really, I think, brought the public's eye onto something that seems quite inane, a stadium, but also implicates a lot of failure of oversight and accountability across a range of institutions. And I think that has been a really interesting example within the public domain. And then, of course, I think our context continues to be one in which there's failure to involve the people who are most affected by weaknesses in PRM, in public resource management. And those are just ordinary citizens, and you and I. I think it's really interesting to have noted how many times the notion of politics and what is political has come up in our conversation so far. And certainly the budget, without a doubt, is a political process. The budget process is a political process, has multiple role players, all of whom have different levels of decision making. And even as we speak, there are decisions being made about which entities to resource, how, why. And there are various entry points for us as civic actors in relation to those decisions that are being made, many of which often, of course, are made behind closed doors for sometimes legitimate, other times not legitimate reasons. What I've highlighted across these, this range of key actors, within the executive, for example, there's an important committee, the Medium-Term Expenditure Committee, which by the time, in October, when many civic actors will be, going into Parliament to fight for budgets or to fight against, austerity measures and so on, by the time we're engaging in that space, this committee has been informed, has had, inputs by a range of actors, and has been within the administrative and political context, done a lot, decided a lot. And so what does that mean when we advocate for more prudent or for more people-centered resourcing? What is the role of civic actors? And again, members of the public, and where are we in this space, in this, this political process? I'll come back to this hopefully with time. These are just quite detailed aspects of what happens when in the context of decision making within fiscal policy, or rather within the budget process in South Africa. So I think the SOE context, this is only speaking to SAA, but I felt it was really important to highlight some of the decisions that are made and what their impact is on the public service as a whole. So we've been told of the significant net loss that SAA has had over the years. Last year, there was 10.5 billion rand allocated to our wonderful national airline in order to implement what's been called a business rescue plan. In September of the same year, this was then amended, and what the term reprioritization is one that I struggle with, but funds were reprioritized, and essentially of the funds that were prioritized or reprioritized to support SAA, many of us will recall that these came out of national and provincial budget baselines, including conditional grants. And I think many in this meeting really lamented the cuts to health, to human settlements and education, within that budget. And those were decisions that were very clearly not progressive decisions and not decisions made in the interest of broader public good. In March this year, we were told that there would be no more bailouts to SAA. And in May, we were told that there was a 2.7 billion rand reprioritization towards SAA subsidiaries through the special appropriation bill. All of these are decisions that are made and trade-offs that are made, again, with direct implications for services. I thought this was an interesting one, harking back to 2008. It's a different SOE, but it's really the same story, with a huge chunk of the budget going to these SOEs, and really whatever else remains is for the rest. I thought that was quite interesting. In Zianda's presentation on the police, which I learned so much in that, really fascinated. I also thought it was interesting to note where the cuts were made. And policing for us isn't an area of advocacy in terms of our organizational focus, but certainly amongst the major or the biggest cuts to to departments, police interestingly featured in that within the 2020 adjustments. Okay, so keeping an eye on my time. In the context of the National Prosecuting Authority, I think there's a lot that's been said already about what the frozen recruitment since 2015 has meant. And that was justified as a result of budget constraints, or justified, or rather was said to be as a result of budget constraints. We have seen, and I think it's nice to have something positive to say, the gradual restoration of the NPA's credibility in recent months and years, well, quite recently. But we also know that staffing is critical given the expertise required to push the agenda or the mandate of the NPA. And so, compensation of employees accounts for 80% of the budget of the NPA. In 2020, the annual report, published by the NPA showed us that there was a 20% vacancy rate across all provincial offices. And much of this was in relation to investigator posts that were unfilled, which of course also predated the budget cuts, or the most recent budget cuts. So some of the results of this was then a scaling down of skills development programs. Many officers also identified, again, budget constraints as a central challenge to their work. We then saw in 2019 notable mid-year adjustments, and an increase to the NPA's budget by about 1.3 billion. And this, I think, is interesting to note in that it followed what Advocate Batohi mentioned or referred to as budget advocacy. Really pushing for the NPA's budget to be increased. So the positive outcome of that was that they were then able to advertise, or at least advertise. Filling is a different point, but 900 posts. 900 posts, that to me is really just unimaginable for an entity to have been functioning in that way. And then the purchase of tools like laptops for prosecutors and staff. Here, the question really is about what kinds of decisions or ostensible changes in political will can we speak of that then led to this increase, having known that over so many years there had been these cuts. I'm going to move along and not speak so much about the details of which units had what vacancies. But certainly, I think it's obvious to us all that understaffed, overworked human beings are, a threat to any organization. Staff morale is low, and particularly in a context like the NPA. So this, the NPA working in an ecosystem is another important thing to remember. So when in March 2019, for example, it was said that nearly a quarter of the, there was nearly a vacancy rate that equated to a quarter of the total staff establishment. That already should be something raising alarm bells, given what we know about the intensive and expert-led work of the NPA. So in 2021, this current budget, the NPA was then told that they would be having their funds chopped by 422 million from a 4.5 billion rand base, and that is already in the context of unfilled vacancies and of positions like financial investigators and analysts. I'll move along. In the context of the SIU, similar trends. There are some positive trends and achievements that we've seen in recent months and years. But again, 41 million has been cut from the SIU's budget over the current financial year, from an already quite small baseline of 438 million. This just little excerpts from a statement that was issued by the Public Servants Association, which I found quite interesting. And in that, in addition to them really raising the alarm about the impact of budget cuts to the NPA and SIU, what I thought was interesting was an emphasis on being let down by the portfolio committee, who had assured the public to the contrary, that these cuts wouldn't be made. And so here the role of an entity or an oversight entity like the National Assembly and portfolio committees is quite important to place a lens on. So to really conclude, I think it is obvious by now that the consequences of poorly run, unaccountable state-owned entities continues to have dire impacts and trade-offs on the public service and in other institutions. And that the erosion of state capacity and the hollowing out, I think this phrase hollowing out has been used a number of times, happens in many ways, and resourcing is certainly one of the most significant ways that happens over time and in ways that perhaps aren't always immediately obvious. In a submission we made to the National Assembly, we emphasized that parliamentary committees do need to do more to influence the systemic deliberations that are linked to public resource management and public finances in South Africa. We also emphasize that the budget cuts and reprioritization, or however whatever language tends to be used around this, in order to save failing state-owned entities, needs to be reviewed. And in particular, these decisions have to be made using a social accountability framework. In relation to the strengthening of capacity to safeguard limited resources, we called for the effective resourcing of key institutions. So these that I've named, many others, but in particular of anti-corruption strategies, which has already been mentioned. And I think it's, again, while we are seeing much more positive sounds, movements and changes in performance of these entities, should we as CSOs not be placing a closer lens on their actual resourcing? Should we also not be doing more in advocating for transparency, not only in the budgets, but also in the decisions that are made around fiscal policy? It's also, from my perspective, it's an opportunity to address weaknesses in planning, in budgeting, and in oversight, and in particular to use open government interventions to address them. Lastly, where fiscal policy and budget processes are related, I think opening up really needs to, opening up these spaces should be particularly happening in the context of budget formulation and planning stages. So including labor unions, including civic actors, academics, and many others in order to create a space for meaningful public deliberation on these decisions. Given what we've seen and given the increased, the increased threats around resourcing and what we would really highlight as poor decisions in relation to public funds. I think I'll stop there, and that's just an excerpt of the overall national budget taken from Vulega Mali, if anyone would like to have a look. certainly the resourcing questions are big and ones that civil society can and should be doing more to address. Thank you.
Zugisa, you're the only one who stuck to time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. You deserve an award. So, comrades, we've got about 20 minutes for questions, comments, debate. I think the message is very, very clear from all the speakers. Two central messages. One, that as civil society, we need to care about the institutions. And that means that we need to do our work in a less defensive way, but proactively, how do we contribute to a capable state? So the question of what kind of a state do you have? By the way, Buthelezi, I think we are conflating state and government. And this is not just semantics, it's very important distinction between a state and a government. So that's one thing that as civil society, PILs, how do we contribute towards rebuilding the state, as it were? But secondly, taking from Zugusa's presentation, that we need to care about the budgeting. It is not enough for us, to go to court later on, but that we need to be involved in ensuring that the budget that is passed is not just poor budget, but that it's a budget that passes constitutional muster. Often the budget that is passed by the state is not constitutional, right? So how do we get involved in making sure that the budget that is passed is really, in line with social justice objectives? There are wonderful models in Brazil. There are wonderful models in Kerala, in India, that we could follow. I won't summarize all the presentation, but I thought, I wanted to highlight Zugusa's point about, us being concerned with resourcing. Benjamin, your point is very well taken, that, we can take as many cases to court as we want. But if the judiciary is underperforming, if the judiciary is not accountable, then we won't have the sort of transformation that we want. Zianda, also your point is, is very central. There is no social justice without a safe, orderly environment. We need a safe society. And as social justice organizations, we don't really focus on the question of what kind of a police force we have. And Buthelezi, yeah, very, very clear that there is no redistribution, there is no social justice without a capable state. There were some comments that were put in the chat. I would invite presenters to have a look at some of those questions. I'll open the floor for questions now and for debates. Please put up your hand and ask your question. I've got a question for all the presenters, but I will not abuse my position. I'll wait for people to ask questions. I'm just trying to see whether anyone's got their hand up. Buthelezi, let me start with you. There is often a binary that is created between the imperative to build a technocratic state, a professional state. But on the other hand, such a state, and by that we mean government, how do we make sure that it's technocratic, it's professional, but that it's also inclusive, that is also, consultative, right? So I worry sometimes when we talk about professionalizing the state, making it more technocratic, perhaps, and not talking about how such a state must be embedded in society also. So how do we avoid such a binary? For Siyanda, can we be safe? You didn't answer that question towards the end. So towards the end, you talked about the need to eradicate the bad apples in society, in the police force. How do we do that as civil society? Besides, advocating for a better IPIT, and that there must be more resources for the police force. So how do we, do these things that you outlined? I think you just stated it, but I will invite you now to say more about what we do as civil society to make sure that we have a accountable police force. And it's a secret whether the debates around the abolition of the police interest you. Somebody has got their mic on. And then in Bex, yes, yeah, if you could say something more about the magistrate court level. The debates focus a lot on the Concord, the CJ, on personalities. But yeah, what can we do there at the magistrate court level? As you say, most people, that's the cause that they use a lot. And a few of us in civil society use those courts. Let me start with those questions, and then we will open another round of questions. Buthelezi, and then Sianda, and then Begisile, and then Zudiso.
Thanks, Tsepo. I think at the most basic level, I think one of the things we have got or we've allowed to happen in South Africa is indeed, I think, the conflation of the political layer with the administrative layer in our institutions. So I think one of the things we need to reset is that, we're going to local government elections, is that when we give a mandate as voters, we're giving a mandate to political actors. What has then happened by stealth and sometimes quite deliberately through legislative means is that we've allowed the politicians to be able to intervene way too far into the bureaucracy, right? Bureaucracies in many ways need a separation and a protection from politicians. Politicians are, in many cases, have their own personal interests that then they try to drive through the bureaucracy. What we need to be able to reset is that line where a professional bureaucracy still takes its marching orders from the program of a political party that we elect. But the politicians are not able to dictate right down to who do you hire as a driver in a municipality. That's where we've got it wrong. So that in countries where this is being done successfully, the bureaucracy has the mechanisms to resist that kind of intrusion. That's one of the things that we need to reset. That what the National Development Plan calls the political administrative interface, and part of the way of doing that is to build a public service that is professional. Technocratic, I think technocratic is one element of it, but we need to not also let ourselves become too technocratic. I think one of the problems we've seen with our National Treasury, for example, is that the technocrats have sometimes very little contact with actually what happens on the ground. It's the fights we have with people in National Treasury all the time, that some of the requirements that they put on municipalities, for example, for reporting are so unreasonable, but they're so convinced that to report the same information to National Treasury, to COCTA, to Provincial Treasury, from a municipality that has no capacity to do so, is the only way to hold them to account. So technocracy itself can go too far, and we need to rein that in as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Zianda?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question. I think, again, the larger question of can we be safe and sort of issues around looking at the police, but particularly in detail, sometimes really fall off the radar I think particularly in sort of public interest law, but also in civil society advocacy, because no one wants to really advocate, in real terms for a reform of the police service. I don't even really want to do that. This is an institution that is huge, it's large, it has a reputation and a real practice of being brutal and violent. And so, I certainly don't want to be one of those people who say, the police need more money or they need more resources. I think Zukiswa brilliantly illustrated it with the graph in terms of the reprioritization cuts that happened to sort of put more money into SAA, and the police budget lost about 1.9 billion rand, if I'm not mistaken. And really, if we're being quite honest, did we even see a real effect of that sort of reduction within the police service when there are so many multiple layers of things going wrong? 1 billion here and a 1 billion there hardly makes a difference, I think, within an institution that's really struggling with deep systemic and institutional issues. And so I think that's problem solving then for that goes along with a lot of what Dr. Buthelezi said earlier about just generally the public service, and how it can be reformed and fixed in terms of reforming hiring practices, reforming procurement sort of processes, and exactly what he's just said also about limiting political interference. That has also had a deep effect on the way that the SAPS works. I think that it's something that I regularly say to people as well, is that we need to really stop focusing on just the police minister and just the National Police Commissioner and those two appointments. Yes, they're important, but they are not the be all and end all of a service that is really struggling and quite literally buckling sort of under the pressure of multiple layers. So there's, I think there's incredibly good work being done by organizations such as the Social Justice Coalition, who are trying to argue and have been arguing for a long time now for equitable policing resources. And that would make an enormous difference in many communities in the short to medium term. There's great work being done by organizations like Abahlali Basamjondolo and the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force that are specifically looking at different areas of police violence that actually really supports the need to work or to have IPID functioning better. So there are different sort of levels and layers at which this could all be tackled. And, I sort of talk about it a little bit in my book, but also in what I've just said as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Bex?
Yeah, I'll latch on to what, yes, I'll latch on to what Ziyanda just said about we need people in those spaces in the magistrates court. What we've found is that there's very little research actually on the magistrates court and in trying to understand how the magistrates courts function. We've tried doing some exploratory research last year to try and understand the phenomenon of corruption, because again, the Afrobarometer survey keeps saying that there's corruption in the courts, but no one really knows who's the corruptor, who's the corruptee. And so we tried to look at it from the perspective of the magistrates. Our magistrates are accused of corruption, and where do those complaints go? And we've looked at the complaint system, and we found actually that there's very few complaints that relate to corruption in the magistracy. That's not to say there's no corruption in that system, but it's to say that it's very difficult to track. So the first thing I think is for us as civil society to have a greater presence in that space. The Funukwazi, for example, working with the right Reclaim the City, they have an excellent project where they help people understand the magistrate court processes as it relates to evictions, and help people monitor those proceedings and alert the authorities, the lawyers, where there are injustices. So we need more of that. Advice offices, which is what Dr. Mbete spoke about, and a lot of people in the sector, Kausa is doing, that we need more advice officers who will monitor on a regular basis what happens in the magistrates' court, at least to generate that knowledge. And then some of that knowledge will help us. For example, what we as Judges Matter started doing to monitor the appointment of magistrates. We've actually set in the interviews and tried to look at how that process is unfolding and what do they look for. And it's still very early days, but right now we need to build the knowledge and be active in those spaces.
Excellent. Zuki, so ultimately, we are talking here about the problem of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, both as a political and also an economic ideology, the idea that you must have a lean, mean state. So it's not just about state capture and the hallowing of state, it's also this commitment to neoliberalism. You are imploring us to look at budgeting and resourcing. How do we do that? Is it by lobbying legislatures? Is it by lobbying politicians to move away from a commitment to neoliberalism? How do we get involved in making sure there's a shift away from austerity?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's multiple opportunities and avenues for different types of organizations and different type of disciplines or activists and actors. So I mean, I'm fully cognizant of this being a space with a lot of litigious-minded people, and I think that is one of the aspects that's really important. So challenging, whether it is through litigation or otherwise, challenging the actual fiscal framework, which I think is a major project, and one that certainly is likely the umbrella project, as it were, of these of this discussion that I've shared now, or the input I've made, which is in a sense kind of rearranging the deck chairs on a sinking ship, in the context of a broader problematic anti-poor fiscal framework or decisions within that space. So I think there's that kind of umbrella context. The other context, which again comes back to the questions about the budgeting decisions once within the context, are also really important. I don't want to sound like I'm being dismissive of those, and that's certainly work for us that over the years has been really important, in that in the short to medium term, those conversations about how to prioritize the existing budget within this kind of broader framework are also really important. And there's advocacy opportunities there as well. If we are smarter, and I think this for me is certainly an area that civic actors and can be much better about, much more strategic, much more direct and targeted in terms of when within the budget calendar, for example, we advocate for these changes, advocate against particular decisions. I think at this point that, despite amazing work being done, for example, in the past by the Budget and Expenditure Monitoring Forum, currently by the Budget Justice Coalition and many others, that are looking at budgeting. Despite that, I think there hasn't been an adequate recognition and adequate momentum built around that work. Add to that, I think there are also avenues and opportunities to do much more work around gender responsive budgeting in this context. And so what Zianda speaks to, for example, around policing and a range of others within the, the justice context, I think there is a lens there that I recognize a lot of important work is being done, but certainly more needs to be done and can be done, even in influencing how those budgets are formulated. Lastly, I would say, I think that there definitely are opportunities to inform the actual processes by which these decisions are made. So to formulate, for example, better, more participatory, more inclusive, budget formulation decisions. The National Treasury at present is doing some work with support by, from international partners. There are, a few on this call who have been part of trying to craft what might be a meaningful and truly open fiscal, decision-making context in South Africa. Currently, we don't have that. What might it mean to actually have a truly participatory process? You touched on the Porto Alegre examples, for example, for instance, and I think there's much to be learned from other actors in the world And even in the context of South Africa, I think that the Imbizo style discussions that likely at some point work better than they do now would really be well used in the context of decision making in budgets. It's a technical space, it's a political space, but it still very much is a closed space. And I think civic actors, civil society organizations can do much more to open that up and to inform how to shape those participatory spaces.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We've got about 5 minutes left. Any questions? Any from the floor? Tapita, you wanna come in, or you want me to read your question, please? Just unmute yourself, Tapita.
Yeah, sure. So I was just, for me, it seems so obvious to challenge the constitutionality of the budget, particularly in light of what everybody has been saying. But the biggest hurdle for me is the separation of powers. If we were to challenge it, particularly because we would essentially be telling government, despite all the resources you have at your disposal and all the information, you've done the allocations of the budget incorrectly. But yeah, how do we change, I mean, other than soft mechanisms to try and influence government by saying, please listen, please allocate these fundamental institutions budgets. It seems like it's an impossible task, but one that's so badly needed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mbogeseni, 30 seconds to have your last word, and then Zianda, 30 seconds, please.
Thanks, Tsepo. I don't think there's much to add. I just want to underline what we've just heard in terms of the need for the fiscal framework to be reviewed. I mean, I think our fiscal framework, in many ways, the reason why things are falling apart at local government level is partly due to our fiscal framework. So I would support that point very strongly. But I also think, just one last point to respond to Tabitha's point now, NEDLEC as one of the places where civil society is meant to have a voice is one place that we need to also call for the reform of. The representation of civil society in that space is very weak. And so government and business are talking to one another and largely bypassing civil society. And that's something that we need to change.
Excellent. 30 seconds, Zianda.
So in the last 30 seconds, I'm going to use this to essentially say I would really like for people to do two things. And I don't necessarily mean people on this call, but I'd really like people to really start questioning the police budget. We need radical accountability from the police and a service that we pay 99 billion rand to that gives out very little in return. And secondly, that we really need to stop focusing on this idea that if we get rid of our current police minister, or we get a new one, or we get a woman, or whatever it is, that'll magically solve the entire institution. This is a structural, deep, and systemic problem, and that's what we need to address if we want to try and fix the police service.
Excellent, thank you. Bex, 30 seconds.
Thank you. I think, yeah, they've said it all, but one thing that I would like to emphasize is that as civil society, as the general public, we cannot cede the judiciary for others to take care of. It is ours, we should own it, and we should take accountability for what happens there. And so we need to be quite vigilant in monitoring what the judiciary does and who is in the judiciary. There's a, sorry. Someone has their mic on, which puts me off track. But the rich have gone out and taken their disputes to private arbitration, yes. But we don't have that option. And so we need to maintain a good judiciary because it remains one of the key institutions for the guarantee of rights, for the realization of rights, and for promotion of a democracy that we all aspire to.
Thank you very much. Zukiswa, the last word goes to you.
Yeah, I think mine's super quick, which is just to say that, public participation in issues of fiscal policy and budget decision making is not a nice to have, it's a must have. And it's something that I think we can collectively push much harder for.
To everyone who participated, we noted your comments in the chat and we will take those to heart too. We will have 15 minutes break, and when we come back, we will go into breakout groups. So 15 minutes, we'll come back at 11:15. Thank you so much to the presenters. Thank you.